Hello and welcome. This is Ukraine World Podcast. Ukraine World is a website and podcast which informs international community about the developments in Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko, and I'm happy to have here Volodymyr Sheiko, who is Director General of Ukrainian Institute, an institution affiliated with the Foreign Ministry and which is basically dealing with cultural diplomacy. So today we're talking about Ukrainian culture and why it is interesting for the world. Good afternoon, Volodymyr.
Good afternoon.
Thank you so much for joining us. So Ukrainian culture, why is it interesting to the world?
A big question. To start with, let's define interesting because, not to be self-indulgent, we Ukrainians might think various different things about our own country and our own culture, which are not necessarily the same for international audiences. So I would split this question, I would say, into two, and look at this question from a perspective of a person who is less informed about the developments in Ukraine, who probably has never been to this country, and we as cultural diplomats, we rather try to focus our activities on people who are less knowledgeable about what's going on here in Ukraine, and there are two different Ukraines in this respect. One that is interested or not interesting for its own citizens, and a Ukraine that is relevant or irrelevant for international community.
If I say that in the past years Ukrainian culture is experiencing its renaissance, maybe comparable to the 1920s, we know this epoch which is very prominent for Ukrainian avant-garde. If I say that probably it's another renaissance, what would you say today?
I actually wanted to say exactly the same, because we at the Ukrainian Institute like to refer to today's developments in the Ukrainian culture as the new 1920s, because Ukraine has experienced probably incomparable but equally fundamental political and social change in the late 1910s and onwards, and of course after the 2013 Revolution of Dignity, which has radically transformed Ukrainian cultural, political, and social landscape. And that's why these two periods in our cultural history can be compared and can be sort of aligned together. And it's true to say that over the past 6 years, with everything that has been going on in Ukraine, the artistic and cultural and creative community at large has been trying to respond to those change through artistic practice, through new structural funding models, through new programs, through passion and appetite for international cooperation, and that all that combined indeed can be referred to as a cultural renaissance, or at least we would like to think so.
We see, I would say it's a boom of Ukrainian movie making, in Ukrainian filmmaking, not only the fiction films, but also the documentaries. We see many young directors of documentary films going around the world and winning prizes. I mean, Irina Tsilik or Alisa Kovalenko or Nadia Parfan and all the others, and it's a fantastic trend. But we also see a new Ukrainian cinema, sometimes good comedies, sometimes fantastically good films about the war. Do you see this kind of also renaissance of filmmaking?
Yes, absolutely. And I think documentary films in particular are one of today's Ukraine's cultural strengths. And, by programming the Ukrainian Institute work, we focus on several art forms, but documentary films in particular. And you were right to mention Irina Tsilik's award at Sundance Film Festival. But also we see that international audiences in some countries, particularly in the Netherlands, for example, where documentary films are quite a big thing, are very willing to know more about Ukraine through documentaries as something that reflects, what's happening here and now. But that doesn't really Renaissance. That doesn't really It also relates to feature films, to films like Atlantis that won a Prime Award at the Venice International Film Festival, and also a film. My Thoughts Are Silent, which we supported at a few international film festivals, which also tell great, sometimes difficult and challenging stories about the country, but they do it in a very honest and very illustrative way.
And they present Ukrainian reality that you cannot really confuse with anything else, right?
Yes.
So it's a real and genuine Ukrainian reality. It's not some copy making from American aesthetics or Russian aesthetics or whatever else, right?
That's right, and they are not constructed to project a particular image of the country. That's what I like about them, because I don't think cultural diplomacy is about public relations for a country. It's not about projecting a very carefully constructed and positively looking image of a country. It's about telling honest stories. It's about telling stories of doubt, of difficulty, of challenge, of hesitation, of happiness, of course. But instruments and possibilities of cultural relations are infinite in this respect, because you can use a variety of artistic media, and a variety of instruments that are available to you to tell, not to just tell stories, but to initiate conversations. It's not about just one-way projection of a country internationally.
Do you see also the renaissance of interest to the old Ukrainian cinema? Like there is a prominent institution called Dovzhenko Center, which is named after Alexander Dovzhenko, who is maybe in the world is seen as a Russian cinema maker, but actually is Ukrainian cinema maker. We also can mention Zyga Vertov, who filmed his famous A Man with a Camera in Kiev, including in Kiev. Do you see that renewed interest to that tradition?
Yes, absolutely. Not just towards film, but also literature, visual art, and other art forms that have been produced in this territory, in this country for the past century. And I think it's a matter of a wider issue that Ukraine actually today's contemporary Ukraine tries to reinterpret its past and its cultural heritage in a contemporary, modern, and very discursive way. Because it's not a secret that many artistic and cultural phenomena of Ukraine are more or better known as belonging to other countries, to other places, due to fluency of cultural interactions, due to mobility, due to, of course, colonial policies of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. I think a lot of Ukrainians felt that they were stripped away of their cultural heritage, and the Dovzhenko Center's efforts to make that great, fantastic cultural heritage of the 20s and the 30s, 1920s, 1930s, vocal again and relevant again are most commendable.
And let's not forget that many films of that epoch are basically either lost or are considered to be lost, and it's a huge this process of finding these films. And one of the recent exhibitions in Dovzhenko Center was called Lost and Found, as far as I remember,
yes.
Right? But let's also turn to visual arts. I mean, you mentioned this trend of kind of a modernizing Ukrainian tradition. That's a very interesting thing, modernizing, even post-modernizing. I think this is something, the sparkling which goes between the tradition and modernity, right? And that's the most interesting, maybe in such cultural fields as Ukraine. What can you say about visual arts?
I would start with definitions, because modernization is probably not the right word for this, because the early 20th century and the mid 20th century practices in visual arts were modern. That's either modernist or continuing the modernist tradition. So in a way, it is the epoch of modernity. And what we are trying, I think, to do now, or not just we, but other institutions and people in Ukraine and elsewhere, is to look back and look at a wider context in which these works emerged, not just in a cultural context, but also political and social and economic, and a lot of efforts are being made to make these works sound very relevant today. And they indeed are. And one of the projects that I love most, which the Ukrainian Institute did last year, was a project related to monumental mosaics, Ukrainian mosaics of the Soviet period of the 1970s and 80s, which were created by some of the greatest artists of that time, who were confined in the limits of the totalitarian boundaries that were imposed on them, and that art form, which can be seen in probably most Ukrainian cities in public spaces, was one of the few ways for them to express their artistic intentions without actually breaking the limits of what was allowed and was not. And this project we tried to bring the public's attention back to those mosaics, which are now being destroyed or neglected or stigmatized as part of the so-called decommunization processes that we have been experiencing in Ukraine over the past few years, and make those works look relevant through modern technology. So what we did, we worked with a photographer who captured those mosaics all over Ukraine, and we worked with a digital production company to create to animate them and to make a story-driven sort of short film that can be projected onto various places in public places, or it lends itself to kind of a showstopper. I don't know, events or activities.
That's a fantastic thing. I've seen it on YouTube, the projection that you made in Vienna, and I advise our listeners to search it. Basically, I think we will post the link on Ukraine World website on this podcast so that you can watch it. It's indeed incredible. I mean, I understand that it's going along the trends of contemporary visual arts. It's very popular now to project those fantastic images on buildings, but it's indeed very important that it is based on something that was real in Ukrainian culture. And as far as I understand, you intend to go to other cities as well in Europe with this, right? With this project.
We would love to, and now we are in conversation with the Ukrainian embassy in France to probably do a editing of this film and public projection in Paris either in September or October, but that's still to be confirmed.
That's a great idea. But let me come back to the issue that you mentioned, very important issue, is that what is our relation to the Soviet culture and to Soviet past? Because on the one hand, there is decommunization process. We understand, I don't know if you agree with me, but I personally understand the political importance of it, right? So we need to reflect upon it. It's really, I mean, dramatic when in a country you have monuments to Lenin or to those people who are guilty of mass killings, or when you have streets named after people that are basically responsible for Holodomor or officers of NKVD or Cheka, whatever. But on the other hand, we cannot do it so massively, and we should, I think, understand that there's a crisis in Ukrainian identity. There are some people that tend to believe that all the 70 years of culture are basically a tabula rasa, and we need to erase it. And if we do that, it's basically we are making the same mistake as often do, just erasing part of our past. How to deal with that?
I think it's very wrong to erase something without actually thinking about what you're erasing. I am in principle, of course, supporting the underlying idea behind the decommunization process, which is to stop idolizing and stop admiring very tragic phenomena of our past, and kind of erasing that legacy from our everyday life, like the monuments and the street names, but that cannot be done without actually properly reflecting on that. It cannot be done to monuments of cultural and artistic importance. It cannot be done without fundamental discussions across the society about what the Soviet Union and the Soviet project actually was, because of course it was a totalitarian regime that destroyed millions of people, but at the same time it was a modernization project for Ukraine, and we cannot ignore that reality that that at a huge cost, of course, it brought along other changes to the Ukrainian society.
And we cannot ignore that in the visual, not so much in the literary sphere, because if we take literature or philosophy, well, that was like vehicles of ideology. But if you take visual things, there were many niches when good culture and good art could find its place. You mentioned mosaics, but we can mention also paintings, which we consider to be socialist realism, but there are many good things, right?
And alongside the official Soviet realism, of course, there existed an unofficial underground modernist art, which is only now being discovered through Ukrainian museum collections or through research projects, that has existed in parallel to the officially approved forms of art. And we can speak about Ukrainian modernist music that was born after the Second World War in the 60s, in the 70s. And
you mean people like Silvestrov,
like Skorek, Latoshinsky, and other composers that are not known internationally. And we did some projects with their works, and were amazed by the reaction of international orchestras and conductors who said, "Look, this is fantastic, but we have never heard about these people and these works," which makes Ukraine absent from a huge part of the international cultural map.
Let me come back to music. It's very important, but just to kind of wrap up the visual arts part of it, I think what I have the impression that there is a lot of things in museums which are not exposed, and like art critics, art specialists tell me that, and it's basically something that we still need to discover. So in the undergrounds of the museums, there are still treasures. Do you agree with that?
Yes, because only between, I think, 3 to 5% of an average museum collection in Ukraine is on display permanently or temporarily, and over 90% of these works have never been either taken out of the museum storage, or have never been researched or catalogued. And a lot of museum directors who I've spoken to acknowledge this as a major problem, that we don't even know what heritage and what cultural heritage we actually have at our disposal. And which again brings us to another question of works of art that were displaced throughout the 20th century, who were taken from Ukraine or to Ukraine in the course of the Second World War, or later on by the Soviet government, and which is a major subject of international discussion at the moment.
Let me come back to music. It's a very important. I mean, I'm also amateur musician, so and I'm very interested in music. And it's true that Ukrainian music is still like a visual arts as well. It's a project. It's a big task to discover it. You mentioned Latoshinsky. You mentioned Silvestrov. Well, we can mention even early examples like composers on the brink between 18th and 19th century, like Bortnyansky, which is in many collections is seen as a Russian composer, but who actually so interested in Ukrainian Baroque culture. Your institution makes lots of concerts, right, of Ukrainian symphonic music. How people react to it, and what is interesting in those concerts and those plays?
In our projects, we tend to focus on contemporary classical music. So we try to explore more, the modernist tradition in Ukrainian music, and the generations that came after that, the living composers of today, who I don't think get the attention they deserve from the public institutions or through public funding structures. I think this is also very important to support because, yes, looking back at the classical music and the classical musical tradition is important, but I think it's the newer tradition that can make Ukraine more relevant in the international music community. But also we had a few looks back at the Baroque era of Ukrainian music that links it to the Austrian music tradition or the Western European at large. And, there are lots of names who are unknown here in the country and who, through cultural diplomacy, become more visible, and they are very important to show this continuity and interlinkage of tradition, and that tabula rasa situation, to make sure that the tabula rasa situation doesn't really occur on the agenda, because there was continuity and there is continuity, and it's very important to trace that back.
Contemporary music, but not symphonic, pop music, jazz music is also booming in Ukraine, thanks partially to, I think, a very clever step by the previous governments to introduce quotas on radio, for example. And now, each radio station is has the commitment to broadcast Ukrainian contemporary music. And we suddenly realized how many good musicians we have and how many interesting projects. Again, on the brink, this merge between tradition and modernity. We have Daha Bracha, we have Onuka, we have so many other things. How do you estimate this development?
Mm-hmm. This year we actually planned a few projects with an emerging generation of Ukrainian musicians who are at the beginning of their careers, but who we believe have very strong potential for international touring and representation of Ukraine abroad. This booming music scene that you mentioned has the flip coin has the other side to it, because after the war between Ukraine and Russia had started, the Ukrainian music market has experienced a huge fundamental stress, because a lot of musicians have been extensively touring around Russia, have had contracts with Russian labels, and overnight they had to divert their efforts towards the Western European and North American markets to actually survive and to continue developing their careers. And that stress, I think, has caused a lot of creativity in terms of emergence of new talents, emergence of new bands and new musicians. And for an example, on the 10th of May in Amsterdam, we're doing a big Ukrainian festival that has a very strong music component to it, and we are presenting 10 Ukrainian bands of, I would say not underground bands, but a very emerging new wave of Ukrainian mainstream music, and some of them have never actually performed internationally, and we're hoping to give them this chance of being better known internationally, but also probably which can lead to new contracts and new business opportunities for them, which is equally important.
That's great, because a big trauma for me, it's a dependency of Ukrainian pop culture on the Russian pop culture, which is kind of a sad thing, but it seems that it's now more in the past, because as far as I see the Ukrainian singers, Ukrainian performers, they are much more now oriented towards the global trends. But let me now talk about your institution briefly. You had the Ukrainian Institute, the Ukrainian Cultural Diplomacy Institution. But what we can notice is that in the past years, you finally have kind of new Ukrainian public institutions like Ukrainian Cultural Fund, Ukrainian Institute, Ukrainian Book Institute. Maybe there will be other institutions. That finally the state starts to support Ukrainian culture, which was not the case before. It's strangely enough. Do you see the progress in this field?
I can definitely see the progress through, establishment of the new institutions and much more attention from the public sector towards investing in culture and supporting culture. I would still say that these institutions are a bit fragile in terms of the political changes that Ukraine has been experienced ever since. So it probably will take some time to honestly say that these new institutions are sustainable enough to carry on, but we're very hopeful. What is true that for the first time, I think the public sector has started developing longer-term policies, strategies, institutional strategies, and think about not just what we do, but why we do it, and actually how we are getting there. And that's a massive change, which has happened really in probably 3 or 4 years, or in 3 years. That in other countries, I think has taken more longer to effect.
I think you're all doing a fantastic job, and I wish you good luck, and all of us good luck. What's your hopes for the next 3-5 years? What's your dreams?
My personal hopes or my professional hopes?
No, professional. I mean, what Ukrainian cultural diplomacy will look like according to your dreams, and what the world will know about Ukrainian culture?
I think our ambition is to, and my personal ambition is to make cultural diplomacy work not as a public relations agency for Ukraine, but as a function that will help the Ukrainians better understand themselves and rethink their personal and collective identities, but also make other countries in the world understand us better. There are a lot of prejudice about Ukraine. There are a lot of bad news about Ukraine. I take that. But I think it's through culture that this very honest conversation can happen between peoples of different nations about who they are, about the world we live, about the common challenges we have. And we like to, build every single project that we do on conversations, on discoveries, on emotions, and on a Ukraine that is unknown and thus interesting and thus very exciting to learn about. And I think that can be a very rewarding journey.
Thank you so much for this very interesting conversation. We had Volodymyr Sheiko, who is the Director General of Ukrainian Institute, the Ukrainian Cultural Diplomacy Institution, public institution. This was Ukraine World, a podcast which is telling the international audiences about the developments in Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. Stay with us.